Okay, so at this point, I just want to. I'm still in section 3, but I want to look at the way that we got news. And this is. I just talk about this briefly because it's going to come up again in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, remember, happened in your lifetime. So I know we're getting there. We're getting there. So here you'll see a slide which is about these pools. And this is the way that people like me got news about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Pardon me, about the war in Iraq. That is the Gulf War, as it was known, which we then for a while called Gulf War One, because there was Gulf War Two, until it became clear that Gulf War Two wasn't actually going to go away, and people were like, "Well, what are we going to call this thing?" So it's interesting the way the name changed. But the way that people got news was that they had to do a version of embedding. They hadn't figured out embedding yet, because remember that one of the things that these Vietnam savvy commanders, generals, admirals, Air Force generals, and so on learned was don't let the press in, because the conviction was the press, by telling the story too much, lost a lot of the war for America in Vietnam. So these soldiers were like, no, this time the press isn't going to have access to the battlefield. So what they did was they had these pools. And the way these pools worked was that basically you drew lots. And you had a number. So it's like CBS, let's say, was still a big, powerful organization. CNN, which was made effectively by the war. I mean, the people at CNN stayed in Baghdad as the attack came on. They were like, we're going to stay. And everybody else was like, you're nuts, you're going to get killed. And they were like, we'll take that chance. And that effectively made the cable news network into a thing. And so CNN became the force in the land because they stayed. And so at one point, I remember in the 100 hours of Desert Storm, seeing Bush came to give the same way, that their attitude to the press was, we'll give you exactly what we want you to print, and that's all we'll give you. So if you were a person in the press, you were like, there was nothing to report. Nobody talked. There was nothing. They were like, nope, we're not going to have another Vietnam. Never again. So this was a whole different ballgame for the press. And I remember a press conference where Bush, and he was very patrician at these press conferences. He just sort of spoke and he was like, well, I'm done. Off he went. Because he's a technocrat, so he would stand there and he said, blah, 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 and he gave his briefing, and that was it. And the generals did give briefings, which were pretty much useless. I mean, they were like, well, now we're doing this. It's like, okay, well, what's happening there? It's like, well, we can't tell you. It's a military operation. What do you want to kill our guys? It's like, oh, no, we're patriots. Okay. That was the end of that. But somebody called out to him, have you seen blah, blah, blah? And he's like, I've only seen what you have on CNN. Oh God, I remember that with such clarity. It was like hour 60 or something like that. You could tell. I mean, you could see that they were moving fast. They were moving so bloody fast. It was sort of the same thing that happened, except this was planned, right? But the same kind of thing that happened the first time there was a tank battle in 1917. And the tanks were so successful that they outran the infantry, even though they were only moving at 3 miles an hour. The infantry couldn't believe it. They were like, what the hell? The tanks just moved ahead. And there was no way to fight them. The Germans were like, what's going on here? It was terrifying for everybody. So the way that the news had to deal with things was that basically the military started a pool. And they were like, okay, CBS and New York Times, ABC, NBC, the big networks, we're going to give you spaces. We'll give you, say, 6 slots. You get 6 slots, depending on market share, basically. Big news organizations will give you spots. And we're going to have pools. And it's like, well, what are these pools going to consist of? What it consisted of was that they would keep the press away from the battlefield. And then they would say, okay, well, we just took this southern part of Iraq. Who wants to go see something? And the press was like, yeah, we want to see something. Show us something. Christ, we don't have anything to show. All we can show is planes taking off and landing from outside of airfields. Like, we don't have anything. We got nothing. Nobody will talk to us. We got nothing to tell. So I go, oh, yeah, we'll take you to see something. So they'd say, okay, everybody on the bus. I go, where are we going? It's like, well, you'll see when we get there. So they put people onto like a school bus and run them out into the desert. And then they'd say, okay, everybody can get off, and they'd get off, and they'd be like in the middle of the desert, and they'd be like, you could see a battle had been there. Like there would be these smoking tanks, and they're like, what are we supposed to do out here? It's like, take pictures of the tanks. They're like, okay. So they took pictures of like destroyed Russian tanks. Or there would be a fire burning, over the horizon. They'd say, what's that? It's like, that's an oil fire. Like, what do you mean an oil fire? Like, did you bomb an oil field? They're like, well, we can't tell you that, but you can take film of it. So they would film it, and then they would come back and put it on the television. You could see it, and then they would say, we've been told that over there is a fire, which is, we're told, is an oil fire. And they kept saying, we're told this, we're told that, because they didn't know. Right? And there was nobody to check because there were no locals. I mean, nobody, first of all, very few people live in the desert. I mean, if they are, they're moving through. And they're certainly not going to stay in the desert when there's a battle going on there and get out of the way, right? So these pools, you could sign up for them. And you might get a space because it was a lottery every day. So those are the people who got on the bus. But if you didn't get on the bus, then when people came back, you're like, what did you get? Like, well, first we have to file our stories. It's like, God damn it. Like, give us something. It's like, yeah, we'll file our stories, and then we'll sell our stories to you. So that's how the free press operated in the Gulf War. So did you swim in that pool, or did you drown? Right. So these, I love this. Some pool spots are occupied by reporters working for publications like Mirabella, the Monthly Women's Magazine, Stars and Stripes, which already is, fully owned by the newspaper, by the military. Stars and Stripes is staffed by soldiers. I mean, and every single story is cleared by the censors, by it's a wholly owned. It's like a government news agency. They print what the government wants to print, what they want you to see. And I'm not running down Mirabella. It's just that it's kind of like sending Vogue out. It's like, okay, hard news from Vogue. Today in Iraq, we saw a very stylish. Jesus, like, what are you going to get? So, the last thing in this thing I want to talk about, in this particular section I want to talk about, is the propaganda. And so I'm going to talk here about this very famous case, and there were a number of sort of propaganda stories. Even as the Iraqis invaded Kuwait, it was not clear that the United States had the political desire to engage in military action. There was an enormous amount of division because of this right-left split, where the left didn't want to go to war because they didn't want another Vietnam, and the right didn't want to go to war because they didn't want to get caught holding the bag the way they had before. So there was all kinds of anxiety about that. In this context came this particular story, and it was never clear, well, it became clear, but it wasn't clear at the time where the damn thing came from. It just somehow suddenly appeared. And this young woman, girl, really, began to give this testimony. And it hit C-SPAN. And the rest, as they say, is history.
The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well.
U.S. Congress held a highly emotional hearing today on atrocities in Kuwait.
Newscasts crackled with the story.
Infants taken from their mothers, and a 15-year-old girl afraid to use her real name in case of reprisals against her family in Kuwait.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers.
The first time, I think, when the American people were focused on what was happening to the Kuwaiti citizens at the hands of the Iraqi soldiers.
Human Rights Caucus co-chairman John Porter, who is a Republican, had some quick feedback from one important member of the audience.
I got feedback from the president. I happened to be over at the White House the afternoon later in the evening after the afternoon of the hearings, and the president said that he had seen it on CNN and that he was shocked at some of the things that he had heard.
They had people on
The president repeated the incubator story 6 times in his verbal war against Saddam.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
Daylight brings only the digging of yet more graves as bodies...
Soon there were reports of mass burials of premature babies in Kuwait, dumped from incubators which were then trucked to Baghdad.
The Iraqis tore the respirators from their incubators.
We had to bury many of people.
And the story didn't just have an impact in the U.S. The United Nations convened a rare public forum.
The hardest thing was burying the babies. I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators by the soldiers.
Will those
in a vote 2 days later, the UN approved the use of force against Iraq. Within days of the UN session, a report on Kuwait by Amnesty International quoted Naira's testimony to the U.S. congressman, and they put a number on the infant deaths, 312. Meanwhile, the U.S. Congress was preparing to authorize military force.
Teach us that now is the time to check the aggression of this ruthless dictator whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and have ripped babies from their incubators in Kuwait.
The House easily approved a war resolution. Then it was up to the Senate.
To authorize the use of United States Armed Forces pursuant to United
In the debate, the incubator story came up 7 times.
Mr. Dole, aye. Mr. Domenici, aye.
In the end, the war resolution only passed by 5 votes.
Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
When you look back in retrospect, the things that stand out in your mind are some of those pictures, some of those images, some of those stories. And you think that, in fact, there was the kind of outcome we wanted to happen happened.
So it turned out that this was the most 44 important seconds of film in the frickin' war, because this convinced people that the war was just, that this was not only jus ad bellum, but also jus in bello, that anything you did to destroy these monsters was verifiable. Do it. Whether we could verify it or not, didn't matter. It's like the troops were there. Well, why would the troops lie? It's like, well, you know why the troops would lie. Because the troops aren't actually doing it. PR is doing it. And PR is doing it because the military is running the PR campaign. Because the military is running propaganda. Because the military is not ever going to suffer another Vietnam again. Right? Because they know what happened last time and they're not losing this time. They're going to control the whole narrative. Everything you see will have been run through their hands. In fact, maybe it'll have been made by them. Right? Maybe they'll have produced their own war. How was it that Saddam, who by this time had apparently tortured 100,000 of his own people, had not been not only left alone, but actually supported financially and militarily by the U.S. for 10 years? We don't want to talk about that. So nobody talked about how Saddam had been the friend of the United States and had been allowed to torture and kill with impunity.